On the 42nd floor of Aurora Tower, the clock struck 9 a.m. sharp when the doors to the Helios boardroom closed behind the last board member. The silence inside weighed more heavily than the cold marble floor. At the endless glass table, Cassian Waverly, owner of a billion-dollar empire and an even bigger ego, tapped the tip of his pen on the contract that could decide the fate of his corporation. The room was packed with renowned lawyers, CFOs, and elegant board members, and yet, no one dared speak. The document before him, an international agreement valued at hundreds of millions, was written in a foreign language that not even the hired interpreter, Marcus Ellery, seemed to fully understand. The man's nervous eyes, once confident, now scanned the lines as if searching for miracles. Cassian arched his eyebrow, a half-sneer played on his lips, and the tension grew. There was no room for error. A single mistranslation could cost not only money but also Waverly Dynamics' reputation among global partners. It was then, as the weight of shame fell upon the professionals, that an unexpected sound shattered the heavy air. From the corner of the room, near the side door where the maid Nara Azevedo discreetly stood, came the firm, yet young, voice of her son. Theo Azevedo, just 12 years old, looked up from the notebook where he was absent-mindedly scribbling. Without hesitation, he faced the tycoon and said, "I know the answer, sir." The echo of Theo Azevedo's words echoed through the glass walls of the Helios boardroom as if it had been an insult. For a moment, no one could believe what they had heard. Eyes shifted from the contract on the table to the skinny 12-year-old boy, wearing a worn school uniform and a backpack leaning against his chair. The contrast was stark, multi-million-dollar suits against the simple, faded coat of someone who didn't belong in that world. But it was precisely from there, from the invisible, that the boldness had emerged. Cassian Waverly, accustomed to seeing only executives bowing before him, leaned back in his leather chair. The uncomfortable silence that dominated the room was broken by the deep, ironic laugh that escaped his lips. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, as if about to applaud the boy's boldness. "Do you know the answer?" he repeated, laughing. A boy, the maid's son, daring to correct what renowned lawyers and interpreters cannot. The other executives laughed along, some mockingly, others simply to match their boss's humor. Nara Azevedo, paralyzed, clutched her cleaning gloves to hide the trembling in her hands. Her heart raced, torn between fear of ridicule and stifled pride at seeing her son raise his voice in an environment where he should never have a place. Theo, however, didn't back down. His eyes, fixed on the tycoon, carried something no one expected, an almost insolent calm, as if he were absolutely certain he hadn't spoken in vain. Cassian Waverly's laughter echoed like thunder inside the Helios boardroom, but behind it was a flicker of unease. He hated the idea that, even for a second, someone had stolen the spotlight, and, worse yet, someone invisible. With a sudden movement, he pushed the contract forward, sliding the pages to the edge of the table. His steely eyes fixed on Theo Azevedo, as if they wanted to crush the boy's courage with just a look. "If you really know the answer, come here," Cassian said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Show us all that we're nothing but fools, and that the maid's son is the only genius in this room." The executives exchanged glances, some amused, some uncomfortable. Dr. Elodie Kerr, the lead attorney, bit her lip in silence. Even she, experienced in international courts, hadn't dared decipher those lines. The challenge had been thrown down. Nara Azevedo's heart sank as if it were about to shatter. She almost reached out to hold her son back, to stop him from taking a single step. But before she could, Theo was already rising from his chair, adjusting his backpack on his shoulder, and walking firmly toward the table. The contrast was stark, his worn sneakers against the starched shine of the Italian shoes surrounding the room. Yet, he walked as if he were carrying a certainty. Silence fell again, and everyone waited in disbelief to see how far this bold move would go. When Theo Azevedo stopped before the glass table, the scene seemed straight out of an unlikely movie. A skinny boy in a worn uniform and dirty sneakers faced with a contract valued at hundreds of millions, surrounded by renowned lawyers and directors dressed in impeccable suits. The document gleamed under the cold light of the Helios boardroom, as if it were a riddle forbidden to anyone without international diplomas and qualifications. But Theo didn't look away, didn't flinch. He simply took a deep breath, running his fingers over the paper with the ease of someone who dealt with this every day. The executives looked at each other, some chuckling quietly, others visibly uncomfortable. Jonah Blythe, the CFO, shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "This is ridiculous. We're wasting our time." Vivian North, an influential advisor, leaned forward, watching the boys' every move as if sensing something unusual. Marcus Ellery, the hired interpreter, shifted in his chair, embarrassed by his own blunder. The scene defied the logic of hierarchy, an invisible boy challenging the heart of corporate power. In the corner of the room, Nara Azevedo stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly against her blue apron. Her chest heaved in rapid waves, as if each breath were a silent plea to God that her son not be humiliated. The weight of the gazes on Theo was crushing, but the boy seemed to float above them. Then, raising her eyes to Cassian Waverly, she said in a calm voice, almost insolent in the deathly silence, "Do you want me to read it to you?" The air in the Helios boardroom seemed to have stopped in time when Theo Azevedo uttered those words. Cassian Waverly crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, the mocking smile still plastered on his face. "Leia, boy, impress us," he said sarcastically, as if setting the stage for a show he believed doomed to failure. The executives chuckled, certain they were about to witness a public embarrassment. Theo looked down at the contract. The foreign letters filled the page in dense, formal lines, but his eyes ran over them naturally. He murmured a few words under his breath, as if piecing together an invisible puzzle in front of everyone. Suddenly, his voice became firm. "It says here that Clause 14 transfers the intellectual property rights to the foreign company, without a defined term." A murmur ran through the room. The lawyers leaned in, trying to confirm what he was saying, while the interpreter, Marcus Ellery, paled, avoiding meeting Cassian's stern gaze. The silence, previously filled with disbelief, was now pure astonishment. Vivian North placed her hand on her chin, impressed by the clarity of the explanation. Jonah Blythe frowned uncomfortably, realizing the gravity of that clause no one had noticed. And, from the corner of the room, Nara Azevedo's teary eyes reflected a mixture of fear and pride. The son everyone ignored, who until minutes before was just the maid's boy, had just dismantled, with a single sentence, the illusion of superiority that dominated that table. Theo Azevedo's statement fell like a bombshell in the Helios boardroom. The previously sarcastic looks now turned to disbelief. Dr. Elodie Kerr, an experienced international contracts attorney, pulled the paper closer and scanned the lines quickly, her eyes widening as she confirmed, word for word, what the boy had said. "He's right," she murmured, almost in disbelief. The confirmation rippled through the room like a thunderclap, eliciting nervous murmurs from everyone present. Jonah Blythe, the CFO, was sweating discreetly, trying to calculate the impact of that hidden clause. He had always trusted Cassian to have complete control of the negotiations, but now he realized the company might have signed a suicidal deal. Vivian North, a veteran board member, let out a slight smile, as if recognizing a rare talent emerging where no one would have expected. Meanwhile, actor Marcus Ellery sank in his chair, devastated by the shame of having failed in his role. Cassian Waverly, however, remained motionless for a few seconds, simply staring at the boy. The mocking smile had disappeared, replaced by a tension he had never shown before in front of subordinates. The entire room felt the weight of this change, The tycoon was no longer laughing. And, deep within everyone, the same question grew. If Theo could uncover this so naturally, what else was he capable of revealing? The murmurs ceased as Theo Azevedo calmly turned the page of the contract. His finger traced the lines as if he were reading a simple story, not a document capable of moving fortunes. With each word he uttered in a low voice, more eyes focused on him. Finally, he looked up and said firmly, "It is also written here that, in the event of a dispute, all judicial decisions must be made in foreign territory, under laws that favor the other party." An even heavier silence fell over the room. Dr. Elodie Kerr quickly confirmed the translation, clapping her hand over her mouth in astonishment. Jonah Blythe let out a muffled curse, realizing that this clause could ruin any legal defense Waverly Dynamics had. Even the coldest counselors shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with the idea that they had let something so dangerous go unnoticed. The air reeked of discredit, and everyone knew, without the boy, the company might be about to sign its own doom. Across the table, Cassian Waverly clenched his jaw. His face, previously marked by arrogance, now showed the first crack of insecurity. He hated this. Hated seeing a 12-year-old boy, the housekeeper's son, expose in front of everyone a flaw he could never admit. But behind his hardened expression lurked a truth impossible to ignore. Theo not only knew what he was saying, he was saving the entire company. And the entire room waited, silently, for the next bombshell to come out of his mouth. Interpreter Marcus Ellery tried to shrink back in his chair, but there was no escaping the stares now piercing him. The man, hired for a fortune, had boasted minutes before of his experience in international negotiations. However, faced with Theo Azevedo's revelations, his mask crumbled. Cassian Waverly slowly turned his face toward him, his eyes filled with suppressed fury. "So tell me, Marcus," he snapped, his deep voice reverberating throughout the room. "How did you miss such an obvious clause?" Marcus swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his temple. He tried to stammer out an excuse. "Sir, I was analyzing another part. Maybe I got confused in my haste." But the excuse sounded pathetic even to himself. Vivian North raised an eyebrow, as if she no longer had patience for incompetence. Dr. Elodie Kerr, contract in hand, confirmed coolly, "The boy's translation is perfect." The interpreter, however, didn't even come close to the truth. The executives exchanged glances, and the tension morphed into something even more corrosive: contempt. Marcus Ellery, previously treated as the authority figure at the table, now appeared to everyone like a dismantled imposter. But above his humiliation loomed an even more shocking fact. A 12-year-old boy had taken his place with almost disconcerting confidence. And this, to Cassian Waverly, wasn't just an affront, it was a direct threat to his authority. The entire room still reverberated with Marcus Ellery's humiliation, but everyone knew there was something even more delicate at stake: Cassian Waverly's pride. The tycoon, accustomed to being the most powerful voice in any room, felt the unbearable weight of being challenged within his own domain. His hand gripped the golden pen tightly, as if that simple object were the only shred of control he had left. He couldn't bear the thought that eyes that had once feared him now curiously searched every word that came out of a boy's mouth. Cassian leaned forward, his tone lower, but laced with venom. "Very well, boy. You want to play genius? Go ahead. Show us all that your audacity is nothing but a cheap trick." The sentence, though spoken with contempt, betrayed a detail few noticed. There was hesitation in his gaze. It was as if he desperately wanted Theo to make a mistake, so he could crush him in front of everyone and restore his supremacy. Theo Azevedo, however, showed no fear. His brown eyes, illuminated by the cold light of the Helios boardroom, held the magnate's gaze with an almost defiant serenity. A soft murmur ran through the room, as everyone sensed they were facing a decisive moment. If the boy confirmed his resolve, Cashin could lose more than respect. He could lose control of his own table. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next word Theo would dare to utter. The silence was so thick in the Helios boardroom that the distant ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Everyone anxiously awaited the boy's reaction to the tycoon's provocation. Theo Azevedo took a deep breath and rested his hands on the contract, as if the weight of millions were nothing compared to his calm. In a firm voice, without raising his voice, he began to translate another passage, this time even more complex. It is written here that, if the company signs without objection, it waives future royalties in emerging markets for an indefinite period. A shudder ran through the room. It was a clause that could destroy years of innovation and billions in revenue. Dr. Elodie Kerr, taken with seriousness, immediately confirmed the accuracy of the translation. The impact was instantaneous. Previously skeptical directors now saw the boy as the only light capable of saving the corporation from disaster. Vivian North, who had maintained an analytical posture until then, let out a soft applause, soon suppressed, but enough to reveal what everyone was beginning to feel: respect. Cashin Waverley's face hardened, trying to hide the fury consuming him. He was visibly struggling with his own vanity. With every word Theo spoke, the authority he had built over decades of power crumbled before his eyes. Still, he tried to maintain control, lifting his chin and giving the boy an icy glare. But what was visible in the eyes around the table was no longer blind obedience to the tycoon. It was curiosity, admiration, and a dangerous sense of loyalty directed toward the boy. Leaning discreetly against the side wall of the Helios boardroom, Nara Azevedo observed every detail as if her heart were about to burst. Her hands, still marked by cleaning products, were clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew her son better than anyone. She knew of the sleepless nights Theo would devour foreign language books borrowed from the public library. She knew the sparkle that appeared in his eyes whenever he deciphered a complicated text. But seeing him there, in front of tycoons and lawyers, was like witnessing an impossible dream come to life. Pride, however, was mixed with visceral fear. Nara feared that, at any moment, Cashin would cruelly ridicule the boy, crushing the trust he had so hard earned. She had been humiliated so many times in that environment that she knew the cruelty that power could wield. But Theo did not tremble. His serene posture, firm gaze, and clear voice made her witness to something she had never dared imagine: her son being listened to, respected, almost revered. Tears threatened to escape, but Nara held them back. She didn't want her emotions to betray weakness in front of that elite group. Still, silently, she offered a prayer that her son wouldn't just be a passing curiosity for those men and women, but that he would be seen for his true worth. And in that moment, with the entire room waiting for the next translation, she realized something powerful. Theo had already crossed the line into invisibility. He was no longer just the maid's son. He was becoming impossible to ignore. Cashin Waverley could no longer bear the weight of the stairs. The boy, whose seconds before had been invisible, now commanded the attention that had always been his. The tycoon adjusted his tie with a brusque gesture and leaned across the table, his deep voice filling the Helios boardroom. "Very impressive, kid, but memorized translations don't save companies. Tell us, do you truly understand the impact of what you're reading, or are you just parroting words?" The attack was calculated. Cashin knew how to play with contempt, transforming talent into trickery, courage into insolence. The executives held their breath, waiting to see the boy falter. Jonah Blythe, the CFO, crossed his arms, anxious to see if Theo would resist. Vivian North narrowed her eyes, as if sensing Cashin might be digging his own trap. The entire room leaned forward, like an audience member in an invisible duel. Theo Azevedo, however, was undaunted. He lifted his chin and, instead of stuttering or flinching, turned to the contract and explained in detail how each clause concealed legal and financial risks that could ruin Waverly Dynamics. His speech was firm, precise, and filled with confidence. It was impossible not to notice the irony. The boy Cashin was trying to reduce to nothing was demonstrating greater mastery of the subject than the professionals paid handsomely to be there. Humiliation was no longer a threat. It was an inevitable reality. The impact of Theo Azevedo's words reverberated like a flash of lightning in the Helios boardroom. The boy, just 12 years old, had dismantled clauses that could have cost Waverly Dynamics billions, and he had done so with a clarity that would have left any expert speechless. A heavy silence fell over the room for a few seconds, until Vivian North began clapping, slowly and steadily. The sound echoed through the room, solitary at first, but soon gained strength as other board members joined in. The applause wasn't mocking, but genuine recognition. Executives accustomed to ignoring any voice outside their circle of power now discreetly rose from their chairs to applaud an invisible boy. Dr. Elodie Kerr, always restrained, bowed her head in respect, while even the suspicious Jonah Blythe seemed unable to hide the surprise on his face. The look on each of their faces made it clear. The maid's son had just achieved something extremely rare in that environment: legitimacy. From the corner of the room, Nara Azevedo could no longer hold back her tears. Pride and emotion overflowed her eyes as she struggled to maintain her composure. Cashin Waverly, however, remained motionless, applauding only with a crooked, forced smile that barely concealed the venom of his frustration. For the first time in years, her authority was shattered in front of her own team. And everyone knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The sound of applause reverberated like hammer blows in Cashin Waverly's mind. Each clap felt like an accusation, a cruel reminder that control had slipped from his grasp. The tycoon, accustomed to commanding entire rooms with a single glance, was now merely a spectator to a 12-year-old boy's triumph. His fingers trembled slightly on the glass table, and for a moment, Cashin realized there was no honorable way out. Either acknowledge Theo's achievement or risk losing the board's trust forever. With visible effort, he rose from the leather chair and straightened his tie. Silence fell again, the applause ceasing in respect for what seemed like an inevitable announcement. Cashin's eyes scanned the room, meeting gazes that had previously been submissive and now demanded answers. When he looked at Nara Azevedo, he noticed the emotional gleam in her eyes and immediately looked away, as if he couldn't bear to admit that his invisible employee was the mother of the boy who had just saved his company. "Very well," he said, his voice deeper than ever. "I recognize that the boy demonstrated something none of you have. But make no mistake, that doesn't mean he has a place here." His speech, laced with wounded pride, sounded like the desperate attempt of a dethroned king to hold on to his crown. But the message was clear to everyone in the Helios boardroom. Cashin Waverly had lost. The absolute respect he had once commanded was now shattered, and the authority that had seemed unshakable was no longer the same. The silence that followed Cashin Waverly's words didn't diminish Theo Azevedo's achievement. On the contrary, it only magnified it. Everyone in the room knew the tycoon's speech was merely a last-ditch attempt to protect his own wounded ego. But what was already etched into the collective memory was indelible. An invisible boy had changed the course of a billion-dollar negotiation. The executives exchanged knowing glances, as if secretly sharing the certainty that they had witnessed something historic. Vivian North was the first to break the tension. She approached Theo, placed her hand on his shoulder, and said in a clear voice, "Today, you didn't just save this company, kid. You reminded us that talent doesn't recognize status." The gesture drew more subdued but sincere applause. Dr. Elodie Kerr nodded silently, acknowledging each word with the respect of someone who recognizes greatness where it's least expected. Even Jonah Blythe, ever skeptical, inclined his head in approval. From the back of the room, Nara Azevedo wept shamelessly. Her tears were no longer of fear, but of absolute pride. She knew that, no matter what Cashin said or tried to erase, no one would ever be able to reduce Theo to the role of the maid's son. In that moment, before Manhattan's elite, he had earned something no title could give, non-negotiable respect. The consecration lay not in the applause itself, but in the reverent silence that now surrounded the boy. The weight of that morning at Aurora Tower would never be forgotten. The Helios boardroom, accustomed to being the stage for decisions driven by numbers and egos, had witnessed something far more valuable than any signature on paper. A 12-year-old boy had dismantled the pride of an empire with the strength of knowledge and the courage to speak out when everyone else remained silent. There, before tycoons and lawyers, Theo Azevedo proved that no social position can silence the truth. For Nara Azevedo, the scene will be forever etched in her heart. For years, she endured looks of contempt, the weight of anonymity, and the certainty that she would never be noticed. But seeing her son light up that room, she understood that dignity doesn't depend on the uniform one wears, but on the invisible strength we carry within. Theo didn't just save a company. He rescued his own mother from the silence imposed by a life of servitude, elevating her along with his victory. And for all who witnessed it, the lesson remained that would echo beyond the glass walls. True greatness is not measured in titles or fortunes, but in the courage to rise up even when the whole world expects you to remain down. The maid's son silenced a millionaire, not with shouting or anger, but with wisdom and dignity. And perhaps, on that day, everyone learned that despising the little ones is the biggest mistake a powerful person can make. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like. Here you'll find, every day, moving stories full of lessons that inspire and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.